So welcome everyone to the Introduction to Wisconsin Hazardous Waste Requirements. And this is the first program in a series of 6 where we're going to be discussing and looking at the changes that have been put in place by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources as a result of updating the hazardous waste generator standards. And these were updated because the US EPA had updated its standards, which then in turn triggered the need for the Wisconsin DNR to update theirs. So we're really excited to bring you this series and just hope that you have just gain quite a bit of knowledge from it, as well as some good contacts for you to reach out to when you do have questions. So the program is brought to you by a variety, where it's brought to you by all the trade associations that are listed here, as well as the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and the Sustainable Green Printing Partnership. And actually this group meets on a regular basis as the Wisconsin Printing Industry Council. So we meet on a monthly basis to work on issues that directly impact the printing industry and look to create resources such as this webinar program series to help you, the printer, understand your regulatory requirements, as well as develop guidance documents to help you navigate the system. So my name is Marcy Kinter, and I'm the Vice President of Government and Regulatory Affairs for the Printing United Alliance, and I will be your moderator today. So I really do hope that you do have questions, because we do have an opportunity for you to offer a question or a comment, and there's a question box on the right hand of your screen. So please go ahead at any time and put those questions in. Now, all attendees are muted, so we encourage you to use your screen to ask comments, to submit questions. And just so you know, we are being recorded, and the recording will be available and sent to you in an email following the program. So with that, we will go ahead and just take a look at all the sessions that we're going to be offering. So again, as I said, these are all designed to help you, the printer, understand regulatory changes and, most importantly, how they apply to your facility. We've worked with the Wisconsin DNR and have broken the hazardous waste regulations down into these 6 sessions. Now, all sessions will be offered through the Great Lakes Graphics Association. So I encourage you to visit their website, glga.net, visit their website and take a look at all these sessions and register. They are free of charge, and we're offering them to you as a service to help you understand your regulatory requirements and, most importantly, provide you with the important guidance that you need. So as you go through and take a look at all these sessions, they may look a little bit daunting, but I encourage you to sign up, and hopefully the program introduction today will give you a bit of an overview of what we're looking at. So today's session, we are going to look at the program, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources program. We're going to take a walk through the website and the guidance documents that are available to you. We're going to have a little bit of a discussion on common violations. I always like this part because we do get some really funky pictures. And then we're going to have an introduction to hazardous waste, universal waste, as well as used oil. And this is all meant to set the stage and the common ground for the following sessions that you're going to see. So what I'd like to do first is to introduce our speakers today. So I'm really excited that we have these speakers. So we have Andrea Keller, who's the Hazardous Waste Prevention and Management Section Chief with the, with the Wisconsin DNR. We have Amy Walden, who's the Hazardous Waste Management Specialist with the Wisconsin DNR. Now, Andrea is going to be walking us through the program overview. She's going to give you a little bit of insight into how the program works. And Amy will be talking to you about the website, the guidance documents, as well as looking at those common violations. And then my colleague, Gary Jones, who's the Director of Environmental Health and Safety Affairs for Printing United Alliance, will be talking to you about the wacky world of hazardous waste, universal waste, as well as used oil. So with that, I turn it over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Marcy. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the introduction and kickoff to our series of these informational sessions. I wanted to just make a note that if you find today's session a little bit too on the light side and not as much of a deep dive as you would like to see into any of these topics, I really encourage you to look at those the outlines for the following 5 sessions, because we do intend to go deeper into all the new and existing elements of the new rules, both generator improvement rule and the DSW rule, which has a high likelihood of being of relevance to our printers on the call today. So the main purpose of showing this graphic is to really give you a sense of where our staff are located outside of just our central office functioning. Each purple box on the map of Wisconsin here represents one or more hazardous waste inspectors. So you can see that they're somewhat spread out across the state to provide coverage. But if you look a little more closely at the key, you can see that we have an understanding of where our large, small, and very small quantity generators are located. There were over 1,024 generators just in Dane County alone, and you can even visually see that there's a large volume of large quantity generators. So in the areas where we see more industry, we tend to staff at a higher number. The majority of our inspectors are located in the greater Milwaukee area, and we have other clusters in and around Madison and then up in the Fox Valley area. Next slide. So this is just a little bit of kind of reaching into how do we interact with EPA? How do the state programs work with EPA? The federal record regulations are the overall overarching umbrella by which the states are required to basically align with. And in Wisconsin, we actually have a statutory requirement to align pretty much identically to the federal regulations. So we work very hard to try to stay up to date and current. It's not an easy process to get our rules promulgated here in the state. It's become a very lengthy process. It typically takes about 27 months from start to finish to basically get the approvals, do the public comment period, write the rules, and kind of integrate it into our language. Wisconsin is a very specific language. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about how you can crosswalk between the federal and state. And I do just want to emphasize that we are probably 99 point some high level number identical in intent to the federal language. So if you see a word change here or there, that's really a Wisconsin kind of legislative requirement on how we write our rules, but the intent really is to be very much aligned with federal regulations. The key here also is that RCRA is at its core a preventative program. The goal of this program is to minimize the potential for exposures and releases in order to protect human health and the environment. And in order to effectively manage the large volume of facility sites and cleanup operations, EPA authorizes states to run their own programs. In Wisconsin, we're a little bit different. Each state tend to parse out their programs a little bit differently. But in Wisconsin, our corrective action or our cleanup program is managed through our remediation and redevelopment branch rather than within our hazardous waste section. So if you do experience a spill or release, you would be primarily working with that branch of the department rather than directly with our hazardous waste program. EPA provides grant funding to states and maintains oversight, and then they also have national initiatives that are implemented at the state level, and EPA will come into the state to inspect state facilities, both generators and treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. This means that you may be inspected by EPA inspectors. They would be coming out of Region 5, which is located in Chicago. You may be receiving information requests relating to these inspections. And in some cases, you may see DNR staff along with EPA staff during the inspections, as we are a cooperative program, but there's always going to be one lead agency. So it's always important to note which agency is the lead agency if you experience a joint inspection. When it comes to national initiatives, EPA releases these in enforcement alerts, and they did issue a new one in June of this year. And I do encourage you to go and search. You can simply Google EPA RCRA enforcement alert, and that will take you to kind of their historical releases. This most recent release presented more information on their national compliance initiative that's focused on reducing hazardous air toxic emissions at hazardous waste facilities. And this initiative does impact this audience today. It relates to failures to control organic air emissions from certain hazardous waste management initiatives. And these emission standards in Wisconsin are found in NR 664 and 665. Subchapters AA, BB, and C, which we collectively refer to as the RCRA air regulations. And these regulate the air emissions from certain process vents, equipment links, tanks, containers, and surface impoundments. The reason that EPA has focused on this particular activity and potential for release is that they've determined that these uncontained organic air emissions are contributing significantly to ambient ozone formation, increased cancer rates, and other health risks. Releases to the air from process vents, equipment, tanks, containers, and surface impoundments can result in on-site worker exposure and at times nearby community exposure to hazardous waste volatile organic compounds. So with respect to how we integrate on one of these national initiatives, our program has increased our training. We've received training from EPA. There's been some collective training and equipment sharing, in improved resources on these topics. And the awareness has very specifically impacted, I think, our folks in this state in the sense that they're seeing inspectors, both federal and state inspectors, focusing a little more directly on, in particular, BB, CC, and tank issues in the state. And so when we get into the slides pertaining to common violations, you're going to see that for the printing sector, there's a few violations that they experience or violation discoveries or alleged violations that they experience at a higher rate than the general population, and it is very specifically related to air emissions and this federal initiative. Next slide.
Where's my? There we go.
Thank you. So this map is actually a pictograph that EPA puts out that indicates the promulgation of specific federal rules that are of interest. They have a similar map for DSW if you're interested in where that has taken effect. And you can see from the key what they're trying to do here is they're trying to show which states have neither adopted nor authorized on any particular regulation which is administered by EPA, and where the states are generally. So when Wisconsin underwent their most recent rule update, we captured many rules all at once. It was a pretty significant package. It was over 700-page rule package. And a lot of it was because there was a lot of renumbering and restructuring in the generator improvement rules based on the attempt to really streamline and provide some clarity to the users. So we're very happy to say that we've adopted the rules. We have yet to get authorized. That's a whole nother process. But as you can see, what ends up happening across the country is a patchwork of where states are in their adoption process. And this impacts you if you're operating multiple facilities in different states, or you're sending your material for processing or management under certain regulations to states that may not have adopted those regulations. So the main point here is to be aware of what state you're operating, which state regulations you're operating under. And for the most part, the majority of the federal regulations do not promulgate nationally at one time. They do have a certain subset of regulations that do become effective nationally, regardless of the state process. But they're few and far between. Next slide. So this is just emphasizing the cradle to grave component of the RCRA regulated activities, and provides a little bit of the numerics on how many facilities we have in Wisconsin. We tend to have around 430 to 480 LQGs in the state. That number has been fluctuating lately. It has been dropping. Some of this is due to the fact that we have had some economic impacts. As I'm sure you're very aware, the last year has been difficult for industries overall due to the pandemic. We also are seeing some changes in status because some of these regulations have allowed for folks to reduce their generator status. Particularly on the pharmaceutical side, there's some abilities now for those healthcare facilities to drop their status very cleanly. On the generator side of the house, episodic generation is going to allow folks to not have to operate at a higher status. They're not going to be bouncing in and out of an LQG status and potentially even out of an SQG status. So this is good news for the generators in the state, kind of maintaining that lower regulatory threshold. But I just wanted you to kind of get a sense of the volume of activity that we have in the state. Nationally, about 98%, and this is very much a paraphrase statistic here, but historically about 98% of all hazardous waste is generated and managed by LQGs and TSDFs. And so you can see that RCRA focuses primarily the brunt of their regulations on those larger generators. I do want to make a plug for session 4 here, which is going to focus on manifesting and transporting requirements, which is really that cradle to grave piece and the transportation piece that has been changing now with e-manifest and more access to the data in RCRA info. And so I really encourage you, if you've got questions on how to access the system or how to interface with the system at a federal level, that you rejoin us for session 4. The next 2 slides, and you can feel free to go forward, Marcy, are meant to really give you a crosswalk or understanding of how to compare our Wisconsin code to the federal code. And this will mainly be probably a resource for you at a later date, but I just wanted to make sure that you could kind of see that we've tried to align numerically as best we can with the federal code citations. So if the federal code citation is 260.1, the state code citation is 660.01. So if it's a 200 series at the federal level, it's a 600 series in Wisconsin code. We've got a lot more zeros running around in there. Again, that's because we have to show all the zeros. Otherwise, it just has something to do with how we publish our rules. And then the other piece of it, could you back up 1 slide, Marcy?
Sure.
Thank you. So I wanted to just really emphasize this lower box that's really showing you how to translate back and forth between the subset rules, right? So 262.17a is 662.17.1. So A1, B2, C3, etc. And this is really helpful, especially if those of you who are more familiar with either the federal code, or they work in states that adhere more to the federal citation, or if you rely on resources such as the McCoy's reference books, which are 100% written in those federal code citations. So this is just a tool for you. Thanks, Marcy. You can move to the next slide. So here, what I really wanted to emphasize is that we are aligned kind of into 3 large buckets when it comes to providing technical assistance. And so as I work through how to reach our program and reach out to our staff, I just really wanted to emphasize what was available to you. So the first bucket here is our regional field staff, and they're spread out across the state. Typically in a region, you might see the same person year after year. We have a lot of turnover, and we have some regional changeover and turnover. So, maybe this is a new person each time, but there's ways to reach out to them and talk to them directly. And I do encourage you to talk through issues with our staff prior to us coming on site for an inspection, because we're here to provide technical assistance and help you work through your questions. So regional field staff conduct inspections, they respond to complaints, and they go forward with enforcement if necessary. The next bucket is really our central office staff. Those folks are really geared towards TSDF, plan review and licensing, guides development updates, and the rule promulgation, but they're intrinsically kind of involved with all the guidance, all the policy decisions, the communication, and the training. And we're here as well as a resource, including our program coordinator, Mike Ellenbecker, who, if you join us for later sessions, he is going to be kind of lead on some of our more technical topics. Then the last bucket might be the folks you're most used to dealing with. These are environmental program associates, and while they are regionally based, they're very capable of handling questions across regions because the questions tend to be the same. These folks deal with data management, they deal with annual reporting support, they deal with transportation licensing. They're the folks who you deal with if you're going to be putting in a new notification on the 8712 form, which we're going to get to more in the future. Next slide, please. So this is our staff directory, and I think Amy's going to walk through a little bit of how to reach our resources a little later in this session. But what I wanted to really focus on here was In the subject matter, you can query by specialist, and it will show you the counties that these folks operate in. The subjects range from, I want to know how to, EPID number to manifest to notification. Those first 3 bullets there will get you to our program associates. If you start querying for recycling or hazardous waste requirements, you're going to find your resources on some of these other topics. And so this staff directory is just from the main DNR page. You would select the contact button and you'd be able to go in and find by county who you need to reach out to. Next slide. This is an example of what would happen if you were to search hazardous waste specialists. So this is now listing our current active specialists covering the state. So you can see that depending on the region of coverage, folks have more or less counties of operation. And here's all of their contact information. And I am sure that these folks would be happy to help you in advance of any inspection. We very much want to support compliance through technical assistance. It is better for all parties if we can help you stay compliant rather than moving into any type of enforcement situation. Next slide. And this slide just these are our regional program associates that I mentioned earlier, the ones who you would want to reach out to during your annual reporting cycle if you're having trouble interfacing with the system. We've got 4 currently covering the state. They're fairly interchangeable, so if you have an urgent question and you want to reach out to anybody outside your region, I really do strongly encourage that you do so. These folks are very used to the kinds of questions you get, and if they don't know the answer, they will make sure they reach out to us and get that answer for you. So next slide. I think this is the time when Amy's going to step in and talk about common violations. And I just wanted to make a note that when we talk about the common violations, we're querying our database that goes back with over like 15, maybe even 20 years worth of data. So this is our understanding of how generators in Wisconsin are operating, and every state seems to have a different bucket of common violations, but this is just where we're at with our data capture at this time. And as I said, the printers have kind of a different subset of violations. So.
Great, thanks, Andrea. And I want to remind everyone that you can just ask your questions and we'll get to them at the end of the program. And with that, I will turn it over to Amy to walk us through the website, the guidance documents, and also talk a bit about common violations.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay, so welcome. We're going to talk a little bit about our website and the guidance documents. In the past, we've gotten some feedback that people couldn't find information on our program where they expected it to be. So the department as a whole has done a redesign of the web page, and we've taken that opportunity to revise how our resources are laid out there. Next slide. So the only thing you need to know to get to our website is dnr.wi.gov. That will get you to the website. You don't need any www or HTTP, whatever. You just put that in your browser and it will get you there. So what they did with the new web design is they created these tiles with pictures on them, so it kind of gave you a sense of what you were looking for. And the hazardous waste program is part of the Waste and Materials Management Program. So if you put in the word waste after you get to our website, this is the page you will see. And what I'm going to do is walk you down that initial page so you can see what's on that page, and then we'll go to some specific hazardous waste pages, and I'll give you some other keywords to get there. So next slide, please. So right below that slide, you just saw that said waste and materials. There are the 3 sub-programs that we have. We have the hazardous waste, solid waste, and recycling and composting. Then there's some smaller tiles on the web page that are more specific to various portions of the program. So depending on, this is a nice page to go to because it'll tell you about all waste and the regulations for all of them. Because you, in fact, do have solid waste. You probably have some recycling things, maybe not so much composting, but there's other things on our website that may be of interest to you. Next slide. So if you go further down that page, you've got some topics and the contacts. So one of the things I wanted to point out is if you come across a situation where you think something isn't right, you see another business, or you see a situation that maybe there's a spill, that reporting, that top left is the way you can report a solid or hazardous waste complaint to the DNR. Now, if you go down to the next box, we have the Regional Environmental Program Associate identified there with the phone, and if you click on that, you'll get to that list that Andrea just showed you. So again, this is all just on that first page when you go to dnr.wi.gov and search the word waste. So next slide. So go down, but the tiles get a little bit smaller and they get more specific into other things in the programs. There's something on healthcare waste, open burning. And then if you go all the way to the bottom, there are menus for each program that will get you to the program specific pages. And this is what it looks like for hazardous waste. So you can get to here, or I'll also give you another way to get more directly to this. So next slide. So this is the main page. If you go to click on that picture that's hazardous waste, this is where you will end up. And this general overview page kind of gives a summary of some of the things that are the main pieces of the Haz Waste program. And we do have a nice little orange box here that highlights the fact that there were new rules effective September 1st, the generator improvement rule, the pharmaceutical rule, which probably doesn't apply much to you folks, but also the definition of solid waste rule. And on this, in this box at the bottom there, we have a link directly to the new code. So that if you go to that main page, you can go find that new code right there. As you scroll down this page, there's more basic information about the program. This is the overview page. And then if you see on the right-hand side here, you've got another menu called additional resources. So next slide, please. So this is your best bet to help you find what you need. So in order to get to, well, this is on the main page. We'll start there. So again, this first thing that says hazardous waste overview, that was the page where we were. So every LQG and SQG needs to fill out an annual report every year. So they will want to know where that annual report information is. And we update that information every year based on whether it's a short form year or long form year. And it looks like, I believe in the 2020 report is a short form year. So it's a little less, fewer questions to answer. So that's for this year. So we have a whole definitions page that lists all the definitions that are part of the hazardous waste program. We're in the process of updating that for all the new rules. So that, you know, there's definitions that come up in all of those new rules that really make a difference on how you understand what's happening with the changes. So that's a good page to visit. Then we have the manifest page, which talks about how to register in RCRA info to allow you to get to the e-manifest system to view your manifest. You could also use it to get there to sign them and various other things. You can choose at this point to keep an electronic record in that database as your record for your manifest, or you can go there and print them out, or you know, talk with your transporter to find out how they're giving you those final copies, because those are some of the things that we'll be asking for during the inspections. The next page is notifications and resources. We're going to talk about those in depth a little bit more in the next few minutes. The universal waste page, healthcare, household hazardous waste, and then if you haven't already subscribed, we actually have sort of a monthly, sometimes every couple months, every quarter, newsletter or information blast that goes out that talks about, it's called the Hazardous Waste Decoded, and it basically updates you on rules, documents that are new, any webinars that we have coming up, etc. So that's a good thing to have in your inbox when we send those out. So next page, or next slide. So this is the notification page, and I want to go into a little more detail on some of these pages because I want you to understand, where you can go. So one of the things that that we did here is we tried to put everything that was a notification on this one page, because with the new rules, we have the LQG to VSQG consolidation of waste. We have the hazardous secondary materials that need to be notified, the healthcare stuff, and SQGs now need to re-notify every 4 years. And then we also have the episodic generation piece that's new. So this page notification starts out with the EPA Form 8712, which is the form that you would use to make any changes to your activities. Your EPID number, your facility name, your location, etc. So so there's two ways you can use that form. There's a paper version that you can fill out and then fax into the EPAs or Environmental Program Associates that Andrea talked about. Or you can go to RCRA Info. If you already have an eManifest system account, you already have a RCRA Info account. And so what you can do is go into RCRA Info and then look for My RCRA ID, which I probably should have put on the slide here. I wasn't thinking about that, but it's called My RCRA ID. It's one of the applications in RCRA Info, and you can use that to electronically submit, prepare and submit the 8712. Anytime you do make a change in the 8712, it is staff at the DNR, the Environmental Program Associates, that look at that information and make that change. So sometimes they have questions about what's been submitted, and they may call you to double check to make sure that's really what you intended to do. So I think that's it. Yep. Next slide. So the next tab on the notifications page is the episodic events. And we are going to talk more on generator status and episodic generation in session 3. So some of the things to know about the episodic generation rule is that it allows for one episodic event per year. And planned events need to be notified to the department within 30 days prior to the event. So we kind of need some advance notice that you're planning to have something that would qualify for that. Things that would qualify for a planned event are excess chemical inventory removal, tank cleanouts, short-term construction or demolition, and equipment maintenance during a plant shutdown. There is the possibility, of course, of unplanned events where the notification to the department is within 72 hours of the event. And those type of events could be an accidental spill, production process upset, product recalls, or active nature, tornado, hurricane, flood that has caused some additional hazardous waste to be generated. So there is the possibility of, if by chance you have a planned event, you have an unplanned event, or I'm sorry, let me back up. So if you have a planned event and an unplanned event occurs, there is the ability to petition for that second event. Typically that second event is a planned event, but it could be either way. It just depends on how your year plays out, and it is per calendar year. So we do have it lower down on this actual tab. There's a link to a form where you can fill that out and provide the department with a petition for why you should have a second event. Now, one of the things to know is there's a couple places where we have on the website forms that are fillable forms, and there's some very specific instructions on how you get to those. And I tried to get to one yesterday, and I forgot to follow the instructions, and I ended up in no man's land. So you sort of have to look. We have provided the instructions on the page, so you just have to remember to look through that before you try and open the document so that you actually get what you're looking for. I think that is it. Yep, that's it for that one. Next slide, please. So I skipped over the HHW and VSQG collection tab only because I don't think that any of your facilities are doing that. So anyway, this one I think is important. So this is the hazardous waste accumulation time extension. So this is something that's been in the rules for a number of years, maybe from the beginning. And we sort of pulled this to the forefront once COVID hit because I was hearing from waste haulers that facilities were canceling their pickups. And I said, well, you know, if they're an LQG or an FQG, they still have the 90 and 180-day time frame. So you need to call them back and let them know they still have that requirement. So one of the other things that came up in the discussion is there is the ability to, prior to that expiration time, either the 90 days or the 180, if you know something has come up that you need an extension, you can request an extension of 30 days. So if something happens where a hauler all of a sudden stops hauling and it's your day 80 and you know they're not going to make it by day 90, you can go to the website here and click on the form and request an extension. Next slide, please. So this is my very favorite page. This is the hazardous waste resources page. And for me, when I go to the website, this is what I put in the search feature, hazardous waste resources, because it'll get me to this page, which is what I use the most, the codes, the inspection forms, and the publications. And it also provides on that same page that additional resource menu, so I can get to everything I'm looking for. So the administrative codes in Wisconsin, Chapter N, are 600 through 679. Those are all the hazardous waste rules. Now, if you look on this page, you see current hazardous waste rules effective September 1, and these don't really look like they're even in the 700 range. So there are other chapters. There's a sweep program administered by the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, and there are other programs that have rules that kind of overlap with ours. So if you were to scroll down this page, you would see all of the 600 through 679 broken out in pieces with links to where you can find the actual code. And next slide, please. So again, this is the next tab on hazardous waste resources. This is where we keep the inspection forms that we use as inspectors. And you'll notice right now it says very small quantity generator at the top. So right now we do not have the large quantity and small quantity generator inspection forms available. We're making some changes to those forms. And so they will be there in the next couple months or so. But I wanted to show sort of where they are. Let's go to the next slide. So the inspection forms are a really useful tool for facilities to self-audit. They are the same inspection forms that we use when we come out. So it really helps you provide a training tool for the employees that is, useful for improving compliance. These forms that we're creating now, based on some of the new rules, updating them, they are a little bit more detailed. They've been expanded to include more requirements because of the new rules, and we've organized them a little differently. So they are a little bit longer, they're a little more detailed, but they get to I feel like they get to the crux of any violation a little bit more directly. Next slide. So the last tab on hazardous waste resources is publications. This is where we've previously had something called an electronic guidance system, which we would direct you to, and we had some of our publications sort of sprinkled throughout the web pages, but we thought it was easier for the public and the industry to find that information if we just had a single page where we listed everything. So that's what we've done here. So you can see some of the documents there. So we have a general hazardous waste requirement section. I think there's some industry specific, not industry specific, generator specific documents. There's a section for universal waste, used oil, and healthcare. So as you see next to the publications tab, there's a lot of space over there. And that's where our webinars are going to be posted. There'll be another tab next to publications on the right that will be, say, webinar. And that's where the DNR webinars that we've been holding over the last couple of years are going to be stored. I'm hoping to get that together soon. Next slide, please. So the documents that we've been working on, there have been 64 that we've either updated or created from scratch because of the new code. And I wanted to give you sort of a heads up on what they should look like if they're the new documents. So they're going to have this header, and it's going to have a subheader that says guidance on hazardous waste requirements. On the right-hand side, there's going to be a grayed out box that has a direct link to the code, so that if you want to refer to the code itself, you can. And then back on the left, in the sort of grayed out text, is the actual code that applies to the statements above. So if you're looking for the actual code information, you can go there and find out what we've tried to use more simpler language to make it easier to understand. But we wanted to direct you back to what the code actually says. And then at the bottom, we have a new footer that says DNR Waste and Materials Management Program, the revised date, and then the publication number. So if your document that you find on one of these links has all that, which the episodic generation of hazardous waste does, it's one of the ones that's completed, then you know it's one of the new documents. Next slide, please. So here's a list of all the documents that we, well, not all the documents because there's not 64, but the ones that have been completed or are close to completion. So we have waste determination, record keeping, which we're going to be talking about in one of the other sessions, closed containers, closure requirements for LQG, central accumulation areas, and the facility, which is a new rule, common hazardous waste violations. We have a whole publication on that, similar to our presentation today. Container and tank labeling and marking, which is part of the generator improvement rule. Episodic generation, hazardous secondary materials and legitimate recycling, hazardous waste tanks. We have 3 new documents that sort of walk through the inspection process for both LQGs, SQGs, and VSQG generators. We have a lamp and bulb management, LQG consolidation of VSQG waste, and LQG contingency plan requirements. We also have updated the quick reference guide, which actually talks about all 3 categories, LQG, SQG, and VSQG, to identify at a glance with reference to the code what the general requirements are for each of those categories. We have another, we've updated the satellite accumulation document and the training requirements. So all the ones in blue text, if you can see the blue, are all the new documents. And I think there's a couple other that aren't even on there yet. So there's a lot of new information. So we really would encourage you to go to the website and look for these new documents and start reading through them so that you have some understanding, so that when you come to the other sessions, they make sense to you. Next slide, please. So every document that we've created new has a resources and contact information paragraph at the very end of the document. And what we did is we didn't want to have too much going on in the document itself, and we wanted to be able to direct you right to the web page where you needed to be. And since we have all the publications, inspections, and administrative codes on one page, we can provide a link directly to that. So that link will take you right to the hazardous waste resources page. There's our dnrwi.gov, and then there's a direct link to the staff directory. So this should get you to all the places that you need to go. Now, one of the things to know about a couple of the documents is that we do have some example, I guess I'll call them forms for lack of a better word. On the waste determination and record keeping, there's a tear-off page that is sort of a checklist for when you do a waste determination. It kind of prompts you to look at various things and either choose yes or no, or provide information to support that waste determination. So it's a nice cover page when you do your waste determination to have all that information right there and put it in the file with the, any waste profiles and land disposal records. Another document that the printer industry is probably somewhat familiar with is the solvent contaminated wipes rule, and that one has a tear-off page to help document what's being done at the facility to keep track of those solvent contaminated wipes, whether they're going for laundering or whether they're being handled in such a way that they can go into the regular trash. I think there's one more. Oh, the training records one. There's a example training record tear-off page on that one that can give you an idea of how to keep records so that when we come to visit to do an inspection, you've got all that information right in hand, in place, and you can just pass it off to us for review. Next slide, please. So we're going to move on to common violations. And as Andrea said, we did some sort of a query of our database, and it seems that the same ones come up pretty often. So this is our standard list of common violations. Waste determinations are something that are sometimes hard for people to understand, that they need to do a waste determination on solid waste to determine whether it's hazardous waste. And it's not just, what do I want to say? You need to document the process that you've determined it's only a solid waste and not a hazardous waste. And that's what that checklist kind of helps you walk through. And there is on this waste determination and record keeping fact sheet, there's actually a flow chart that helps you walk through that process. Marking and labeling, we often see things that aren't labeled, they're not marked with any words. There's literally some material in the drum. Nothing. And it's very concerning that someone could mix things that maybe shouldn't mix together and cause some incompatibility. Then accumulation, keeping track of how long things are being accumulated, both in the satellite accumulation area and the central accumulation area is very important so that you stay within the rules of your generator class. Container management, using appropriate containers, keeping them in an area where they're not getting damaged or possibly tipped over, keeping them covered if they have volatile chemicals in them, and just using a appropriate container. Manifest and land disposal restrictions. Manifest have gotten a little bit better because of e-manifest, I personally think, but the land disposal restrictions still have, we still find that folks really don't know how that plays out in most cases. So that is one of the sessions that's coming up, and Mike Ellenbecker will be talking about that. Emergency preparedness and contingency plans. Though the emergency preparedness applies to the SQGs, contingency plans, LQGs. When facilities have hazardous waste and other things that they store, they really need to make sure they've got a contingency plan or have emergency preparedness in case something happens to keep employees safe. And then all the way, all these things come together in training. Training is probably the most important thing to do for the employee health, for the efficiency of your business, and just making sure that the facility isn't generating more waste than it needs to. Then I've kind of put in the bottom here in the blue the publication, common hazardous waste violations, that goes into a little bit more detail on this part. We're going to go through these anyway, but if you need a document for later, that's the one. Next slide. So the common violations in the gray are what we talked about in the big picture. And the ones in the blue are sort of the ones that we've identified that come up for the printing sector. And they have mostly to do with the tanks exemptions and the the BBCC requirements. So they're, marking and labeling, maybe not done sufficiently. The containers really need to be closed. In the BBCC, it's a lot about the volatile chemicals being kept in the containers and making sure they're not getting out into the ambient air. Manifest and LDR requirements, they seem to keep cropping up everywhere. Accumulation dates and time limits, and most importantly, the leak detection monitoring and the marking of the valves. So those are some of the things that we're going to cover in this section 6 when we talk about hazardous waste tanks, exemptions, and hazardous secondary materials. Next slide. So I've mentioned this publication. This is the old version because it said it was revised in 2017. So there is a new version on the way. This is going to be talked about more in that second session on December 16th. So sometimes there's a failure to conduct the waste determination at all, properly characterize the waste. One of the things that people have talked about in the past is something called generator knowledge. And I think EPA has kind of dropped that word generator knowledge because it was been misconstrued as the generator knows, so it must be true. And so we've sort of gotten rid of that because some folks just didn't quite understand that determination needs to be supported by acceptable knowledge. So either an SDS, some kind of research that has a company with a similar process with similar waste that has some sample analysis that shows that they would be equivalent, actual sample data of the waste itself. There needs to be something to support that determination. And then the record of the waste determination needs to be kept so that when we come to inspect, we can say, okay, we see you have 5 waste streams here. Let's see the determination you have for each one. And it's easy for a person to pull out the file and hand it to the staff person or the inspector to review. And then this is a sort of a screenshot of that checklist. And I think we changed the name to waste determination cover sheet or something like that. We're not quite there yet. And next slide, please. So marking and labeling. So failure to mark containers and tanks with the words hazardous waste. And now that we've adopted the generator improvement rule, they also, not in addition to the words hazardous waste, there has to be an indication of the contents. And then you can use any of these bulleted methods here. There's the EPA hazardous waste characteristics, ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, or toxicity. There's DOT, labeling, there's OSHA, there's NCA, the GHS stuff, and then, other markings or labeling commonly used nationwide in commerce that would alert workers or emergency responders to the nature of the hazards associated with the contents in the container. So they found that, the words hazardous waste don't tell an emergency responder whether they should use water or some kind of foam. They need a little bit more information so that if there's something going on and there is a fire or explosion or potential, they would know how to respond to that. Next slide. So here's some examples that we've seen over the years of containers that people have wanted to reuse that weren't really maybe the best choice. You really want to have a container that's compatible with your waste, probably not out in the elements, not necessarily reusing a drum that is dented or is rusting. The chances of it, the integrity being lost and then having a spill is probably higher in that case. And then just some of the labeling. I mean, it's perfectly okay to use a piece of duct tape and write the word hazardous waste, but now you also have to have something else that actually identifies the contents. This other one, it looks like someone wrote with a white marker waste oil, which is fine. It's just, you want to think about the fact that this is going, could be traveling through multiple transporters, whether it's a hazardous waste or not. And you want them to understand what they're handling. Plus, you want it to be safe while it's in your facility. Next slide. So labeling. So it's okay to put a new label over an old label. It's not as sufficient to cross things off and then add something else. It makes it a little confusing to the people who are trying to read it. So you just need to make sure you've got a label that has the generator name, the address, the contents, the date, and again, the hazards. And the words hazardous waste, of course. So next slide. So accumulation violations, failure to mark the central accumulation start date when you're moving something from the satellite accumulation to the central accumulation, exceeding storage time limits, exceeding that 180 or 90-day time period, and exceeding the accumulation volume limits. So generators are required to ship their hazardous waste before the accumulation time period ends or the volume is exceeded. So if you're an LQG and you have the 90-day time period, you don't have a cap on your volume, but you have a time limit. And because you have that shorter time limit and that higher volume, there are more requirements that you have to follow as an LQG. So if you are generating less and you're in the SQG category, you have little less waste that you can generate in in 180 days, and then you can't exceed that 13,200 pounds of non-acute waste. And then, of course, the very small quantity generators, they don't really have an accumulation time, but they have accumulation amount, and their requirements are even less. So you really need to know where you fall based on your accumulation of waste per month, and it is per calendar month. So you sort of need to be tracking what you're doing as you go along through the year and make sure you stay in your category. You don't want to have us show up and you think you're a small quantity generator, but in fact you've done some generation in the last few months that bumped you into the higher category. Now, with the episodic generation coming into play, there are some situations, as we talked about, that would qualify for episodic generation if they're planned, and even if they're unplanned, that would not bump you into those other categories. So it's really important to understand how that all plays out so that if that comes up for your facility, you know how to apply for either the planned event, unplanned event, or the second event. Excuse me, next slide. So in the central accumulation areas, it's always useful to have a written inspection log. And we want folks to understand that they really need to read each entry so that and really look around and make sure they've identified any problems, and really describe a solution or a fix. I tend to see a lot of forms that look like someone just came over to the page and checked off the boxes. You really want them to look, because this will help you prevent not having things having any violations like unlabeling, undated material, anything that maybe looks like there's a container that got damaged or it's not closed properly. So it really helps you identify problems before they become even bigger problems. And it's really good to have a date and an initial excuse me, or signature, so that you can see who actually did that inspection of that central accumulation area and when. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So again, accumulation violations, exceeding the waste limits at the satellite accumulation areas, or failure to mark the containers. So at a satellite accumulation area, which is at the point of the generation and under the control of the operator, the limits are no more than 55 gallons of non-acute waste, or no more than a quart of liquid acute waste, or no more than 2.2 pounds of solid acute waste. Excuse me. So you need to know whether your wastes are acute or non-acute. That would be number one, and making sure you have containers that maybe allow you to easily determine whether you've met that threshold or not. Once you've met that threshold, within 3 consecutive calendar days, you need to move that material to your central accumulation area or directly off-site. And again, now you're marking the words hazardous waste and the contents of the container. So there isn't that additional labeling requirement. Next slide. So here's some examples of containers. Failure to use the correct container. If you've got something that's corrosive, you want it to be in a plastic container, not a metal drum, because it will do its job and eat its way through the container. You want lids closed. For volatile chemicals, you want them closed completely. For some of the dry ingredients that maybe don't have an air component to them, sometimes the lid being just on top is sufficient. We have a document called Closed Container that really drills down into a little more detail on what's required for each type of container and type of materials. You want to mark or label the container, as we've talked about, making sure the date goes on the container once it's in the central accumulation area. And again, it's really good to have tracking of what you're accumulating, because when you're determining your monthly generation, you're including what's in the satellite accumulation area. So it isn't just what's in the central area, it's also those smaller satellite areas. So you really want to have a good tracking system so you can maintain your generator category if you're in VSTG or STG status. Next slide, please. And then here's some interesting examples of things that we've seen in the field, some that are very well. You can see the labels on the two on the right. They seem like the area is very clean. Labels are all facing outward. All the drums appear to be closed. Here you've got 2 boxes, one on top of the other, and something has shifted in one, so now it's kind of leaning back. And these other drums on the right, we don't even know what's in them. So, you know, it really makes a difference for your staff, for any emergency responders who have to come in if there's ever an issue, to make sure that things are stored properly. Next slide, please. So open containers. Both of these, this container on the left, I believe, is considered an open container because the latch is not closed. You can see the latch is down below there. So depending on what's in the container, they need to be kept closed when you're not adding or removing waste from the container. And then open containers don't really protect ignition or reactive waste from ignition sources, ignitable or reactive waste from ignition sources. So, you know, it's not just we want the container closed, there's a purpose behind it. So all of the hazardous waste rules were put in place because someone got hurt or because something happened. And it is a little confusing when, you know, you're working and you've got a container where you're kind of using it a lot. You want to just keep it open, but there are reasons for keeping those containers closed. And specifically with the volatile chemicals, you're trying to prevent spills and releases into the air so that the the employees and workers are safe. It also helps reduce the potential of mixing incompatibles, because you have to actually look at the drum, open it, and then, you know, take the time to really know where you're putting your waste, as opposed to, oh, here's an open drum, I'm just gonna pour it in here. It also reduces the potential for direct contact with the waste themselves. If they're in the container and closed, you know, if it gets knocked over, then there's less of a spill as well. So the one on the right, you can see the lid is open. There's a chain, so the little plug doesn't get lost, but it's still open. So just making sure, this is all part of that training piece, is making sure the employees who are working with the hazardous waste really understand what their responsibilities are in terms of keeping the workplace safe for themselves and their coworkers. Next slide, please. So manifesting in LDRs, I'm not going to say a whole lot about this because it's going to be another session, but failure to maintain copies are some of the violations, incorrect or absent waste codes, and failure to produce those land disposal records. So the manifests were required to keep for 3 years. The waste codes are supposed to be, at least one of the waste codes that applies to the waste should be on those manifests. Next slide. Oh, so when someone at your facility is signing a manifest, they really should have training before they sign. I believe DOT provides training on that. There's other sources as well. When they are signing that, if you're an LQG, they're certifying that there's a waste minimization program in place. If you're an SQG, that a good faith effort was made to minimize the amount of hazardous waste generated. And then again, I think I mentioned already, the final manifests are stored in the eManifest database. And the next session on December 16th, we're going to talk a little bit more about the LDRs, or land disposal restrictions. Next slide. Emergency preparedness and contingency plan. A lot of time we see outdated and missing material. Very common to have the contact information for the emergency coordinator be absent. Lack of arrangements with emergency services. Identifying the locations of the waste and associated hazards, and inadequate descriptions of the emergency equipment. So part of the new rules, there's now a requirement when you update your plan as an LQG to provide sort of an executive summary that they're referring to as a quick reference, so that when there's an emergency, you've got a sort of a cheat sheet for what your process is and what kind of waste you have there. Next slide. So we wrap it all up with the training. So all those other things fall into place when the training happens. Failure in the training category, what we see is failure to provide adequate training for employees who actively manage hazardous waste. So the folks that are actively managing the waste really need to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it and how to handle it so that they can stay safe. And then in some cases, there's not training provided on implementation of the contingency plan should something happen, and failure to provide training on emergency evacuation elements of the contingency plan for all facility personnel. So office people often don't know, contractors that come in don't know what to do in case of emergency, and the requirement is that they should all be trained so that they understand what to do in an emergency. And I think that might be my last slide. Next slide. Yep.
Great. Thank you.
Marcy, thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Great information. Again, keep those questions coming. And now we're going to hear from Gary, who's going to give us a little bit of background and talk to us about the issues and really define for us what hazardous waste is, what universal waste is, as well as used oil. Gary?
Yep. Thank you, Marcy. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Super. Well, the first comment I want to make is, as Marcy mentioned, we're part of the printing council. which is an organization of really the printers and the printing associations that are helping host this and the DNR. And it's really an excellent and a very, I think, a very productive relationship that we have with the DNR. And the one thing I want to say is, because Marcia and I work with a lot of states around the country, and for the printing operations in Wisconsin, you guys are really lucky because of the resources that the DNR has available. I can tell you that there's other states out there that don't have a fraction of the resources that are available, the fact sheets, the information, the tools. The DNR is really committed to working with the regulated community to make sure that that everyone understands what's required. And it's a great partnership, it really is, and we're really excited to be part of it. So the next slide, Marcy, please. Okay, so I thought what we do is start with a very broad overview, and perhaps you may be aware of this, some of you may be just being introduced to the Hazardous Waste Program. The term that's used, and you heard Amy and Andrea use RCRA. RCRA is called the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, and that's the term, the acronym that we use is RCRA for short. And so when you hear the term RCRA, you think of Resource Conservation Recovery Act. At least that's what I do. Maybe not everybody that has a normal life, but again, since we enjoy these regulatory issues, we immediately, when I hear that acronym, I think RCRA. And the key thing about RCRA is it's cradle to grave. So in other words, as a generator, which most printing operations generate some form of a hazardous waste typically, essentially that means that you're responsible for that waste from the point of generation to the point of disposal. And there's another piece of legislation called Superfund that takes care of abandoned waste areas, and there's also cleanups required under RCRA. So it is a strict and severe liability, and so you do have to be cognizant in terms of the requirements that we're going to be going through in this session, as well as the remaining sessions, about making sure that you properly classify your waste, you properly manage that waste, and make sure that it gets disposed of according to the regulation. And probably the most important point on this slide is that ignorance of the law is really not an excuse. And with the training sessions that we're having and the resources that DNR have available, you really have great opportunities to learn what those requirements are and what needs to be done. Next slide, please. Okay, who's a generator? As I mentioned, it's pretty much any facility or a company that produces a hazardous waste, or an act that causes waste to become hazardous or subject to regulation. What's that second part mean? Well, it really means that, for example, if we have a drum of material and there's a leak or a spill or some type of incident that happens and it becomes a waste, that's going to generate a hazardous waste. And typically printing does generate hazardous waste because the nature of the materials that we utilize. A lot of printers will generate the most common waste, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the next session. The most common waste that we see typically are solvent waste. So a lot of solvent waste are considered hazardous. So generally, most printing operations are a generator. Next slide, please. What are my responsibilities as a generator? Well, kind of what you gathered through what Andrea had mentioned, and really through the violations that Amy was walking us through. We need to identify our solid waste streams that we generate, and it's going to be the hazardous and the non-hazardous. Then our next step is to classify all the waste that are considered hazardous, and this is a critical step. And there is actually a tool that DNR has in terms of doing your waste profile on how to determine whether your materials are hazardous waste or not. There's a variety of ways in which you can do that to determine whether materials are hazardous waste or not. The one thing I will caution you is that I know a lot of printing operations have great relationships with their hazardous waste haulers, and their hazardous waste haulers typically do this as part of a service, but understand that if that hazardous waste is not correctly classified, you, the generator, are responsible for its classification. And I'm helping a member right now in New York State where they actually had 2 hazardous waste streams that were misclassified, and they were actually considered hazardous waste, and they're not hazardous waste. And because of that, when they shipped a large volume because of COVID, they got an inspection. And we're trying to walk through that process of trying to figure out what exactly happened and what should be happen. What I really want to stress is to make sure that your waste streams are properly classified. If they are hazardous, then they're hazardous and why. And if they're not hazardous, why they're not a hazardous waste. Our next step is to determine what our generator classification. You've heard very small quantity generator, large quantity generator, small quantity generator terms tossed around, and there's a session on this. And basically, we have to determine, how much, what determines our classification status is how much hazardous waste we generate per month. And then we need to make sure that we're handling and disposing of our waste properly. Again, the violations that Amy went through, we see that there's issues with respect to handling of hazardous waste, and that's management on site, as well as making sure that we send it off site and it's disposed of properly. And of course, prepare for emergencies. And there were some changes in the regulations regarding the preparation for emergencies. Next slide, please, Marcy. So what's a waste? Well, and I always like to make the comment, and I read a lot of regulatory definitions. We spend a lot of time sorting through regulations, and I have to tell you that probably one of the most tortured definitions you will ever read in any regulatory system is a definition of a waste. And you would think, well, man, a waste material, waste, it's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Well, and then and it would seem on the surface, yes, but because it's a regulatory program and a regulatory process, there's actually some exemptions to the waste, and there's some things that you do to waste materials that may not make it a waste. And then when you get done reading that definition, and we're going to touch a little bit upon those in today's session, you kind of scratch your head and say, well, geez, I thought I knew what a waste was, and man, it's really a complicated situation. But starting at the top, it's basically any discarded material that's not excluded or covered by a variance, and that's where it gets complicated, is the exclusions and the variances. And it can be a solid, a semi-solid, a liquid, or a gaseous waste. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a solid waste. It can be really any material that's no longer usable to you as the generator. It could be outdated or unusable products. A material is considered discarded if it's abandoned, disposed, recycled, or waiting to be recycled. And you say, that's an interesting one about recycling, because I thought recycling was good, and it is. But it still could be classified as a waste, depending upon what's going on with the recycling process, or if it's inherently considered waste-like. And you look at the little caveat that we have, and one of the changes, which is actually a great change in the hazardous waste regulations, is that, and that'll be a subject of a future session, but is if we get involved in a generator-controlled recycling activity, that material may actually not be a waste, and that's a positive thing. Next slide, Marcy. And I wanted to show a few examples of abandoned or discarded. And obviously, the photo on the bottom seems to be a lot more obvious than the photo on the top. But the photo on the bottom shows, if you had a hazardous waste inspector walk into, and this looks like this was taken in an outdoor shed area. If you had a hazardous waste inspector walked in and saw this situation, they're going to start asking questions. They're going to start asking the obvious questions about, well, what are in all these containers? And is it waste material? And is it a hazardous waste? Is it non-hazardous waste? And how do you know? And so it leads to a whole series of questions. And you really got to have answers for those questions depending upon what may or may not be in those materials. Next slide, please. And again, sometimes it's obvious. If it's an inherently waste-like material, like the photo on the left, where someone has written the word bad on it, obviously that's going to be a clue that that material is no longer usable in my process, and it's sitting to be dealt with in some way, shape, or form. The photo on the right was actually one that I had borrowed from another presentation. I don't know exactly what's in that container, but if I was to walk into a facility and see a container looking like that, you're going to say, something's going on here. This looks like this is a waste material, and we're going to start asking questions about, is it a hazardous waste? Is it not hazardous waste? And how long has it been here? And what's the contents, right? So that's an obvious question. Next slide, please, Marcy. Okay, one thing that's important to understand regarding the definition of what constitutes a waste is that a hazardous waste is a subset of a solid waste, right? So a solid waste, that has to be a waste material first. I have to determine that it is a waste, and then I have to take the next step and classify the material, whether it's a hazardous waste or not. And I know we're going to get into that in detail, I believe, in the next session. Next slide, please, Marcy. And this flow chart's provided because it gives you a way to go through a logical process. The first question I have to ask, is it a solid waste? Well, is it regulated or not regulated? If it is it excluded from hazardous waste regulation? And if it is, then it's regulated as a solid waste. If it's not excluded, then is it a listed hazardous waste, or does it exhibit a characteristic, and so forth. So this actual flow chart is an excellent logic tree that you can use when you're dealing with a waste material, when you do your inventory of your waste that you're generating, and it allows you to walk through, ask questions, and based on the answers to those questions will lead you down to the way that that material should be properly classified and the way that material will then be properly managed and disposed of. Next slide, please, Marcy. Exclusions. Well, we talked about exclusions, and there's a series of exclusions. So these are materials that if I hit some of these wickets identified on this slide, that material is actually not a waste. So for example, if I have a material that gets mixed with my sewage discharge and sent down the drain to the sewer authority, even though technically it may be a hazardous waste, it isn't, because it's under the domestic sewage exclusion. Now, one caveat to that, and it's a very important caveat, is that you need to make sure that you're in compliance with the local discharge limits. POTW stands for Publicly Owned Treatment Works, or the sewage treatment plant. So while this exclusion exists, you can't just say, oh, I'm just going to dump the stuff down the drain, and therefore I'm going to be, it's because I put it down the drain, it's excluded. That isn't how it works. You're not allowed to put hazardous waste down the drain, but if you have materials that get mixed with, or say it's a water-based type of material that gets sent down the drain and the sewer authority is willing to accept it, and it happens to be a hazardous waste, then it would be considered excluded from that. So it isn't just that I can just dump this stuff down the drain. Probably the second bullet is very common in printing. We use a lot of wipes to clean presses and other equipment, and if they're solvent-contaminated wipes, whether they're disposable or reusable, which are our laundered wipes, and they're properly managed, they're not considered either a solid waste or they're not considered a hazardous waste. Materials that are reclaimed and recycled and reused in a closed-loop system, again, isn't considered a waste. And a closed-loop system has a very, very tight definition. But likewise, materials that are reclaimed on-site under certain circumstances and materials that are sent off-site for reclamation or recycling under certain circumstances are also not considered a hazardous waste, and that's going to be subject of Section 6. And so scrap metal is another one. Scrap metal being recycled, for example, empty aerosol cans that are being sent off-site for scrap metal recycling are not considered a waste. And again, that's why I said the definition of waste can be very tricky. So you have to look at each of your waste streams that you're generating and ask these types of questions. Next slide, please, Marcy. Okay, so we're going to jump into universal waste. Universal waste is actually, I would say, from our interaction with our members, we get a lot of calls on hazardous waste and hazardous waste management, and then right behind it is universal waste. Now, universal waste, next slide, Marcy, we'll start with an introduction of what universal waste is. Basically, universal waste, the thing to remember is that they're basically a hazardous waste, and that they are widely produced. In other words, these are hazardous waste that are produced by many different types of companies, many different types of organizations, including printing operations. And the key thing about this is that they are a hazardous waste that if you dispose of them, they are regulated and should be managed as a hazardous waste. However, the key is under universal waste regulations, because EPA is encouraging companies to recycle these wastes. If you have these same wastes and you send them off-site for recycling and reclamation, they are in fact not considered a hazardous waste. And so under the universal waste regulations, they are regulated, but the requirements that need to be met are significantly relaxed. You still need to manage them properly, but again, the key thing is that with a universal waste, if I send it off-site for recycling, I don't have to follow all the hazardous waste regulations. But if I throw them away, then they are going to be considered a hazardous waste. And so in terms of the common universal waste that are generated at printing operations, batteries are number one, and there's a whole variety of batteries. Lead acid is probably the most common. Think of those for say a forklift truck or for a powered pallet jack. Those are going to have lead acid batteries. Lithium batteries, NiCad batteries, zinc batteries are all considered a hazardous waste if you threw them away, but if you send them off-site for recycling, they're a universal waste. Lamps. A lot of facilities use fluorescent lamps and mercury vapor lamps, and also kind of going hand in glove with that or other mercury-containing equipment, and mercury-containing devices, which would be thermostats or thermometers, thermostats probably being the most common. So lamps are regulated because of the mercury content, and then mercury-containing equipment such as thermostats are regulated because of the mercury itself. And then the last one is if you have a large enough facility where you would be doing your own, say, lawn care or maintenance, pesticides, unused or recalled pesticides are also considered a universal waste, and you can send those off-site for recycling under the requirements, under the regulations for universal waste. And then most importantly, critically important, and what you'll learn through the series, is that documentation is critical. Having the proper documentation, Amy went through some of those on your, if you're a small quantity generator or large quantity generator, doing the inspections of your central accumulation area, having copies of your manifest. So documentation is very critical, and making sure that you have documentation showing that you're recycling your universal waste is also very important. One note is that aerosol cans and CRTs, cathode ray tubes, right now are not considered universal waste in Wisconsin. So being able to recycle aerosol cans as scrap metal, if you do desire to send those off-site for scrap metal recycling, is an advantage that you have. I think the DNR mentioned that they are considering adding adding aerosol cans to the list of universal waste. That's something that EPA has done recently, and DNR hasn't added those under their rulemaking process, and it's something that they're going to be considering. Next slide, please, Marcy. Okay, so what do I have to do with my universal waste? Well, they're pretty straightforward what the requirements are. My first thing I need to do is collect them in a sturdy, closed container to prevent spillage or breakage. And the word closed is important. We've had facilities that have received citations because the universal waste containers were, say, pretty shaky, or they weren't in a container at all, or the containers weren't closed. So the word closed is very important. And then that's really designed to prevent any type of inadvertent release of that universal waste. Broken mercury containing lamps are considered a hazardous waste. So in the process of handling those lamps and bulbs, you want to be very careful with them. You know, when we were a kid, we used to sword fight with them, which, who knew they had mercury in them, but nevertheless, but broken mercury containing lamps are considered a hazardous waste. And so you want to be careful, if you're replacing lamps or you're relamping your facility, that you put them in. And there's actually boxes that you can get from a wide variety of vendors who would take the waste that are designed for that. And actually, you can put them back in the original box. So in a lot of cases, you can keep the original box and to make sure that they don't break. You need to label each container with the contents in the date. Very important. You need two elements on that label. You need to identify, and I'm not going to run through them, they're on the slide, but you need to use one of the options for each of the types of waste streams that are identified here. And then most importantly, you need to put a date on that container when you put the first piece of waste in it. And then that starts the clock running, because at that point, I cannot keep that container for more than 1 year. So if, say, for example, you have a half a box of lamps, and the 1 year anniversary comes up for that half box of lamps, you got to send it off site for recycling. So you can't exceed the storage limit, and then you need to keep your documentation, as I said, that you sent that off site for recycling for at least 3 years. My recommendation on any waste records is to keep them basically forever, because of the Superfund issue. You want to always have those types of records available in case you ever have to go back and figure out what you did with a particular type of waste. Next slide, please, Marcy. Okay, very briefly, we're going to talk about used oil management. Now, used oil, again, can be a common waste that's generated in printing operations. Depends upon a couple factors, but typically the larger the facility, the more used oil that you generate. Now, used oil is actually a regulated waste. It is not a hazardous waste, but it has, like universal waste, it has its own particular set of requirements. So basically, used oil is an oil that's really coming because it's ended its service life, say, in a piece of equipment. You can think immediately of, say, used motor oil out of a vehicle. And a lot of printing presses contain lubricants and oils that are in printing presses. That's going to be considered used oil whenever it's time to do your maintenance and you have to drain the oil and replace the oil. Next slide, please, Marcy. Used oil management, as we said, there's a set of requirements. It is regulated. As long as you follow the regulations, you're going to be in good shape. So used oil can be managed under the regulations as long as it is recycled. And the key is make sure you send that oil off for recycling. And there are plenty of service providers out there who will take that oil and recycle it and reuse the oil, and there's a great market for it. What do I have to do? Well, I need, again, containers are very important. They need to be in good condition. They need to be closed as well. And then you need to label the container. And the thing that you're picking up on is labels, labels, labels. We want to be making sure that we're labeling all our waste streams so it's clear as to what's in those containers. But we need to label that container or tank with the words used oil. If we discover a leak, obviously we want to stop the leak and clean it up immediately. And there's actually a specific testing protocol to determine if the used oil is recyclable. And so they're looking for halogens. And typically what you'll see is when the vendor comes out to pick up your, and lead is another one, when they come out to pick up your oil for recycling, they'll do a field test. And a lot of times you'll see them with a colorimetric test. They'll do a field test to determine if the used oil is acceptable for recycling. From a best management practices, not a requirement, but stressed as a best management practice, collect the used oil in a separate container to facilitate recycling. Use clean, closed containers. Do not store near drains, floor drains, or storm drains for the obvious reason in the event that something would happen, if the container would get knocked over or get punctured. We don't want to create a situation where we've got contamination occurring into the environment, and that's really going to make your life complicated. Next slide, please, Marcy. Absorbents and used oil filters. Again, very common because in many instances we can have equipment that may leak, right? And so a lot of times you'll see some absorbent socks that are used to collect that used oil, and it's very important that the absorbents, they are banned from being landfilled unless there's no free-flowing liquid and not a hazardous waste. So as long as that absorbent sock hasn't absorbed any, say, waste solvent or any of the material that make it a hazardous waste, and as long as it's not dripping wet and there's no free-flowing liquids, you can actually send those off to be landfilled as a solid waste. You can also send them off-site for recycling. The facilities that take oil will also take absorbents. If they have free-flowing liquid, you want to collect them for off-site recycling disposal. Motor oil filters are scrap metal once they're hot drained. Hot drain means that you need to be draining those filters whenever they're warm, so that you get a lot of the oil, as much oil out of that filter as possible. And it applies to both non-tureen and tureen filters. And most importantly, they cannot be landfilled. So in other words, you need to send those off-site for recycling. You cannot just throw an empty filter into the landfill, but you need to make sure you're emptying them before you send them off-site for recycling. If you have oil-contaminated shop towels, they can go to laundry if they're not dripping with liquid. So in other words, not saturated, no free-flowing liquids. Next slide, please, Marcy. I put this slide in because I thought it was interesting, because when you look at and these are filters typically you find on automobiles, but you can find them on other equipment. These are oil filters, and it shows you the amount of oil that you can recover out of a filter. And when you look at obviously the amount of oil that's in a filter, it depends upon the size of the filter. But I thought this was very educational so that you can understand that when you have a filter that you take off a piece of equipment, there could be a significant amount of oil in that. And that's why the requirements have you drain those filters before you send them off-site for recycling. Again, these filters cannot go to the landfill. Next slide, please, Marcy. And I think this may be our last slide. We want to spend some time on antifreeze. Again, antifreeze is another commonly generated waste stream in printing. The key thing with antifreeze is that it is not a hazardous waste, and technically it's not a universal waste per se. But the way that the DNR would like you to manage that is that they like to have you send it off as a Wisconsin-specific universal waste if it's destined for recycling. And the encouragement is to actually recycle your used antifreeze, especially if it's coming out of, if you have your own maintenance department for vehicles, then that's the engine coolant that should be recycled. Otherwise, you have to perform a waste determination, and if it's a hazardous waste, you manage it as a hazardous waste. Key things to make sure, again, as with the used oil and universal waste, keep them in a container. You want to label it as used antifreeze. You want to date the container, the date when you put the antifreeze is first placed in it. train employees how to use that, how to handle that used antifreeze properly, and then remove it within 1 year. Now, there's some best management practices, as we saw with the waste oil. Well, I mean, with the used oil, do not store near floor or storm drains. Clean up leaks immediately. Mixing antifreeze with other waste may make it ineligible to recycling due to contamination. And then there's other antifreeze, I'll put that in air quotes, that use are basically coolants from chillers and other equipment. And those are typically found at the larger printing operations. And it may be considered a used oil or an oily wastewater for central wastewater treatment. Again, it depends on what is in that coolant, and the DNR is encouraging us within the industry to make sure that we're actually recycling that as best we can. But it may be considered used oil. So if you have those coolants and you have questions, you can always reach out to us to walk through what you need to do with those. Next slide, please, Marcy.
And it's
And that brings us
time
to
for
questions and answers.
questions.
Yes.
Well, I have quite a few questions, if you'll bear with me while I do these. First question is for waste determinations. And the question is there still an issue relying on waste hauler profile information?
Well, let me jump in on that one, Joe, because that's an excellent question. There's not an issue with relying upon a waste hauler determination. In fact, you want to work with your waste hauler on that determination, because in some cases, for example, you might need a pH test, or you might need a flash point determination done, and they have the resources to do the actual testing for you. But I would caution you to make sure that in that process of waste determination and working with your vendor, you work closely with them. Don't necessarily let them make the final determination. The great example is this. I remember in New York State, they have some computer to plate chemistry. Okay, so the computer to plate chemistry in lithographic printing can have a very high pH. It can be as high as 13.5. In this particular instance, the pH on this plate chemistry was 12.5. Well, the definition of a hazardous waste is a pH of something with 12.5 or greater. So it was right on the borderline. So the waste hauler used the SDS and said, well, pH says 12.5, and so therefore it makes it a hazardous waste. However, what we know from our knowledge of process is that when you use that chemistry in your plate processor, the pH actually comes down a little bit. It doesn't actually come down significantly, but does come down a little bit. So the moral to the story in this particular case is I said, well, why don't we get the pH tested? And so when they tested the pH came out below 12.5. So the waste hauler used the SDS and said, well, it's got to be hazardous waste because the pH is 12.5. However, when you actually do the pH determination, which the waste hauler did do the pH determination, it was less than 12.5. So from that point on, that waste is no longer a hazardous waste because it tested below 12.5. So that's why I said, you want to work closely with your waste hauler in those waste determinations, but you want to be actively engaged in that.
Excellent. Well, as a follow-up on chain of custody, which I think relates to what you were just talking about, on the manifest, can a transporter sign for the facility?
That's an Andrea and Amy question.
Unless that's part of your contract with them. I mean, we as the state have our contractor sign for us, but that's part of the contract.
Okay.
So I think you could do that, but they can't really sign to determine whether the facility has the waste minimization aspect.
Excellent.
So it really behooves the facility. It's on their best interest to have someone who is able to sign.
Okay.
Because you don't necessarily want them signing off on that because they're not the ones who are at the facility.
Yeah. Well,
So
if a facility has a question about the waste they are generating or a regulatory requirement, who should they contact? And who would the question lead to an inspection?
Well,
they-
yeah, I was
well,
say one thing. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say
No,
they can contact their specialist, or they can
Yeah.
contact Gary. You know, if they feel more comfortable with that. You know, like Andrea said, we'd much prefer to talk through an issue with you, your facility, before we're out there for inspection. They don't lead to inspection typically, because we'd rather you learn exactly what you need to do to be compliant. If it's a complaint, that's a different thing. But the fact that you're asking a question doesn't necessarily lead to an inspection. There's a different protocol for that.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I was going to add to that. You know, it depends on if you're comfortable reaching out to the state. I mean, part of what today's introductory session was to do is introduce you to your resources that you have at the state. And I would say generally, you know, questions are welcomed by the DNR, and they don't, as Amy mentioned, they don't necessarily lead to an inspection at all. And, you know, and if you're uncomfortable reaching out to the state, you can certainly reach out to me. And if it's a question I can answer, I'll be more than happy to help you. If it's a question that I couldn't answer, I know I can go to Amy and Andrea and ask the question, and we can get an answer for you.
Okay. Question for Amy. Amy, you're still on the call?
I am.
What is the deadline for SQG re-notification?
I do, of course they asked me something I don't know. I believe it's through the annual report that they're allowed to do that re-notification. So because we have an annual report for SQGs, it's not as crucial because they're reporting to us every year, and we upload that information to Recra Info, and so that kind of satisfies that requirement.
Right, and I do want to draw everybody's attention. I put up the future webinars as we were starting to have some of the discussions. So for those that have questions on waste determinations and land disposal restrictions, those will be covered in our next program on December 16th. And you can see that we are going to be talking some of these topics more in depth on generator status, management and transport and reporting, which would cover our manifests, and then getting into inspections, record keeping, and then tanks, exemptions, and hazardous secondary materials. So I think, Joe, what these questions are showing is that there's actually quite a bit of interest in the new regulations and how they're going to apply to the printing industry.
Excellent. I do have one last question that was sent. Could you elaborate on what is required by a facility when it comes to maintaining access to e-manifest records?
The only thing that's required is that you have access someone at your facility has access to those records when we are there. So we're not going to say, excuse me, we're not going to ask you for paper copies unless that's how you keep them. If you have 1 or 2 or 3 people that have access to that, we'll ask them to show us that they have access to that system and maybe have them copy a couple manifests for us. If the system is down and there's some technical reason it can't be accessed, that is not considered a violation. So as long as what we've asked and what EPA has asked is for each facility to assign someone as the site manager for that facility, and then to have 2 or 3 other people who can also access those records should somebody be absent when we show up for an inspection. And it's also good to have more than one person who can access them. If you have turnover, people are leaving for some other reason, whatever, you don't end up with no one having access to those. So it really is good to have someone as a site manager and then multiple other people that at least can view them, if not even sign them. And there's some more information on our website on that too, I think, and EPA's website regarding site managers and what their recommendations are for having, 2 to 3 site managers per facility.
Excellent. Well, I am done with questions. I wanted to thank everybody for participating today, especially the moderator, which is Marcy Kenter, and then Andrea Keller, Amy Walden, and Gary Jones, of course. we really appreciate you guys stepping forward to do this. We hope to everybody register for the remaining 5 webinars that we're going to be doing. Thank you, Marcy, for putting that up. We will be sending out the recording as well as the PowerPoint as a link download so that you can get to this. I know it's kind of like drinking water from a fire hose. Lots of information, but good stuff. And we look forward to everybody participating in the next 5 webinars. With that, I appreciate everybody's participation today and have a great day. Take care,
Great.
everyone.
Thank you, Joe.